Okay, everybody, welcome to the first chapter we're going to be discussing in this class, which is Chapter 2, The Art of the Ancient Near East. Pardon me for my voice today. What you're going to notice is that every time we begin a PowerPoint, it begins with this introductory slide, which tells you, of course, what chapter we're on, and then you're also going to see a second piece of information at the bottom, which is going to tell you specifically within that chapter what culture we're studying, culture or cultures, and then also beside it you're going to see a period of dates. In this case, we're looking at Sumerian and Neo-Sumerian, and the dates are 3300 to 2000 BC or BCE. Same thing. What that is that's the information that you're going to need to know for exams. So on an examination, for example, you're going to be asked to provide the culture, identify the culture from which an object comes, as well as to give a set of dates. I do not make you know the actual individual date for each object, but rather I prefer, for our purposes, that you know the period. So for anything you're going to see on this PowerPoint, you can date the object 3300 to 2000 BC. Now, why do we begin here in the ancient Near East? This is our first chapter. And the area we're looking at is the area essentially that is framed by two primary rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And the reason we begin here in Chapter 2 is because these are the rivers where we really first begin to see the shift from the Neolithic era, the New Stone Age, when people were mostly migrant hunters, to people that actually settled in small farming communities, and later on in larger, more metropolitan city-states. This begins probably for the first time around 6000 to 5000 BC, where people begin small farming communities. They settled by rivers, first of all, because it provided access to water, which allowed for the growth of crops and the raising of livestock. But secondarily, it also provided an easy route for trade, which became increasingly important as people made the shifts from the small agricultural communities towards larger, more metropolitan cities. This is a complicated region to study. First of all, it has a very diverse geography. You can actually see the region we're looking at. The Tigris and the Euphrates both have their sources in eastern Turkey and then drain into the Persian Gulf. Today, we're going to begin by talking about ancient Sumeria, which, as you can see on your map, is right by the sort of head of the Persian Gulf. It's in the area that is now present-day Iraq, and the Sumerians settled where the Tigris and the Euphrates met, which is near modern-day Basra. The region I'm saying is complicated, primarily because politically, this chapter is not about one single culture. Like when we study Egyptians, we're going to study Egyptians and Egypt. This is actually a region where the cultures, there's infighting, one culture takes over another one, which takes over another one. So there's not one stable universal government we're going to be talking about. Your book will give you all the details, but as an idea, so you see what we're talking about. The Sumerians rose to prominence. They were conquered by the Akkadians, who then were also conquered themselves. Then the Neo-Sumerians arose. The Sumerian state was revived. Then the Babylonians came, and then they established dominance over the region. Then the Assyrians came down from the north, and they conquered the region. And then after a period of upheaval, we finally get the establishment of the Persian Empire, which by 480 BC created the largest empire that the world had ever seen. So this is a very, as it is now, tumultuous region of the world, mostly because the land was considered very valuable, both for, again, the irrigation possibilities, if you were sophisticated enough to harness those water resources, and which the Sumerians were, and also because of its accessibility to water. Okay, so now you're wondering what you're doing in my class. It's art history, but at the beginning we have to think a little bit about archaeology. Much of what remains from these ancient cultures, which are some 5,000 years old, needs to be reconstructed so that we can better understand it. But let's begin by talking about Sumeria. This is a very sophisticated culture, and it's the culture from the ancient Near East that I'm going to spend the most time on. We know something about these people. Okay, so for instance, this is not a unified government in the region. The Sumerians actually formed independent city-states, meaning each little city was separately ruled. It was a very religious culture, so each city also believed that they were favored by a particular Sumerian deity, which they then built temples to in their honor. If you got the favor of the gods, it allowed you protection against your neighbors, it gave you good crops, it gave you fertile land. So the relationship between man and God is exceedingly important for the ancient Sumerians. We know that they were sophisticated enough to build canals to irrigate the land. They had very extensive trade, which you're going to see based on some of the objects that they produce, but we also know that they were a literate culture, and trading records survive from fairly early on, written in cuneiform, which is their sort of written language. In fact, in terms of their literature, we know they were incredibly sophisticated because the Sumerians they are the authors of the world's oldest extant epic poem, a 3,000-line poem called the Epic of Gilgamesh. So we're dealing with a very sophisticated culture. Now, what's interesting about the Sumerians is what survives. And this is something I think about when we think about especially early periods in art history. There's a word called taphonomy. 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 Taphonomy simply means what has survived. So the plain fact is, we're left to the Sumerians. Because again, this region has been through so much, both in its own time, and the Sumerians were conquered not once but twice, but in modern times so much has happened to this region that it's sort of a miracle that anything survives. But what does survive, you have to imagine, must have been important to the Sumerians. In other words, they made things to last. We're not going to talk about Sumerian houses in this class. Houses don't survive. They were temporary structures like they are today. What does survive for the Sumerians tells us a lot about religion, which again seems to be at the heart of Sumerian culture. So we begin by looking at this object, right, this structure, which is, this is the ruins of the Anu Ziggurat and the White Temple. We're in the city of Uruk, which is a very important early Sumerian city, also known as Warka in its present-day terms. Now, what is this? This is a ziggurat. A ziggurat is simply, it's a man-made mountain. It's a temple platform. Like the Sumerians, like a lot of different cultures, many cultures today, and certainly back then, there's the belief that the gods live high. They live above us. They live in the sky. And the Sumerians, living in essentially a flat area, built mountains so that they would have a way to become physically closer to the gods. Now, originally, these are just raised platforms, which we call ziggurats. Over time, and probably because the Sumerians rebuilt these structures many times, they would build one platform on top of another, and so evolves the concept of the ziggurat ultimately as a stepped structure. So you can have a ziggurat which is just a single platform, which is what we're looking at here, and I'll show you reconstructions. But it can also be a stepped platform, which is platform on top of platform on top of platform. So that's what we're looking at. In fact, okay, I know you can't make out much from this picture, but you can see the staircase moving diagonally up towards the right in the foreground, and right next to it you can see the walls of this structure, which was a 40-foot high, as I said, man-made mountain. I can show you another image. This image is just sort of picturesque. It's nice because it gives you a sense of the landscape. It also shows you a sense of scale. But I know it doesn't help us figure out much what we're looking at. Look, there's a problem here. When you build, people build out of what they have available to them. If I said, right now, go outside and build me a house, build me a shelter, you'd probably look for wood. We have a heavily wooded area. The Sumerians had to build out of what they had. And what they don't have is good stone, a good, what we call local stone, quarries that are accessible to them. So for the most part, they built out of what was called mud brick. They built basically out of sun-dried bricks that are not terribly durable. So again, this is sort of remarkable that anything survives from this period at all. So it's a mud brick structure. So this too maybe doesn't help us. So I'm going to move on so we can see a full reconstruction. Okay, so here we are. By the way, you'll notice in these PowerPoints that you'll occasionally see little red words. Those are vocabulary words. Those are things I want you to think about and start to learn. So what you're looking at here is a reconstruction on the bottom from ground level, where you can see the 40-foot high walls of the ziggurat, or the temple platform. They're angled for practical reasons, probably including drainage. These regions around the rivers were prone occasionally to drought, but also to flood. So there are some practical considerations. And so the walls and the platform slope slightly. You can see in the upper right an aerial diagram, where you can see number 3, which is the processional staircase that you saw in the very first black and white image I showed you, which would allow people to literally climb up the mountain, walk into this outside terrace or an open court, with an altar where they could perform ceremonies. And then next to that is the actual, what's called the White Temple itself, which is the building where they would probably house another altar, and very possibly images of a deity, whatever god they worshipped. In this case, it is Anu, I believe, which is the sky god. But also a place where you could leave offerings to the gods. And we're going to look at those sort of objects that have survived. The interior space of the temple is called the cella, the primary room. You can see there's a long rectangular room. It's actually about 16 by 61 feet, which tells you something about them. You know, there's a question I'm always going to ask in this class, or ask you to think about. The question is, it's a phrase, it's a catch-all phrase. What choices does the artist make, and why? Okay, so if I say to you, the interior of this building is 16 by 61 feet, that should tell you something about how the space is used. Go into your church, your temple, your mosque. These sorts of structures are generally congregational spaces. They're intended for the gathering of people, for ceremony, for prayer. That's not what this is. If you say it's only 16 feet wide, it lets you know that this is a space for housing objects for deities, for private visits, but it's not a congregational space. It tells us about how the Sumerians worshipped. We don't know very much about the structure, again, because you saw from the pictures not much survives. We don't know if the temple had a roof or if it was open air. I mean, it's a sky god. Perhaps that was a way to commune with the deities. But the actual term that the Sumerians used for these temples, they called it a Ch2, which is a waiting room. So again, it was literally a place where man could physically interact with the deities that lived above them. What else can I tell you? Okay, so that's the cella, which is the vocab word. The other one is bent axis approach. And this is another thing I want to pose to you guys as we look at the many buildings we're going to look at this term. Whenever you see a building, you have to think about how people interact with that structure. And one of the ways you do that is through procession. In other words, how do we walk into a building? And there are different choices that can be made. I mean, logic tells you, I don't know, if I were making a building, religious building, and I had to climb up a set of stairs, the door would be right in front of me. That's an axial approach. You go in a straight line where you're going. The Sumerians favored a different kind of approach. They had a long, broad staircase, by the way, long enough and broad enough that they were able to bring up sacrificial animals. So we know they sacrificed animals. We found rings embedded in the clay walls, which were places where animals could be tethered temporarily. But also, they forced you to continue to process once you made it up into the courtyard. Because you would come up into this terrace, and then you actually had to walk around to the far side of the building in order to enter the temple. Okay, that's actually the south... Whoa, boy. Now you're going to make me do... southwest side. Right? So the southwest side of that building. By the way, the compass that's on that drawing is pretty useful. The Sumerians built their ziggurats so that the major corners of the structure aligned with the 4 points of the compass. So there's a south corner, a north corner, a west corner, and an east corner. So the entranceway to this temple was actually on the far side of the staircase. So a bent axis approach simply means that when you approach the building from the designated route, you have to turn, several times before you can actually enter the structure. And it elongates, it extends the time of the procession, which means that was part of the ceremony itself. We don't know much about the decoration of these buildings. We do call the temple here the White Temple, and the reason we call it the White Temple is because it appears as if the clay has been whitewashed, meaning there's a layer of white paint that had been put on top of the surface. And we presume that the Sumerians did this because the plain fact is the materials which they built were ugly. They were building in poor materials. They were building out of clay. But we do know that the Sumerians did other things to make their temples more aesthetically pleasing. They found evidence of what are called cone mosaics, right? And so here you can actually see what a cone mosaic is. They would take little cones of clay they could roll with their hands, and they would bake this clay, better clay. They would bake it in an oven in small pieces, which would make it more impervious to the weather. And then they would dip the ends of the cone, the flat end, into paint, and they could actually push it into the clay walls as a way of decorating. So we know they actually did decorate the surfaces. It's just that by the time these places were excavated, all of the cones were found in the dirt. So it's hard to reconstruct what they looked like. We assume some sort of geometric pattern like the type that they've put here. On the note of archaeology, it's very interesting. There's still a lot to be discovered from the ancient Near East. Some cultures, like ancient Greece or Rome, have been systematically excavated for centuries. But the plain fact is that until the 19th century, even the late 19th century, trained archaeologists were not working in the ancient Near East. So it's still entirely possible that whenever you see a hill, that there's things built under it and buried under it, and there's still a lot more to find within the region. Now the question is, what goes in these temples? And we do have some works of art, sculptural works, that survive from the Sumerian period. Mind you, I say the word art with some reluctance. The plain fact is, for the ancient Sumerians, and for almost every culture we're going to study in this class, there was no awareness of art, per se. No, whoever made this head did not say, I am making an object of art. These are functional, practical objects. They had a reason to be made. So it doesn't have to do with the idea of an artist expressing himself. It has to do with an artist making an object for a patron for a very specific purpose. Now this object leaves us with a lot of question marks. The image in your book I'm a little bit dissatisfied with. But although it has some value. Your book talks about this object primarily because of its modern interest, which I guess is good. I mean, these objects that are from the very distant past, 5,000 years ago, continue to have value for us today. And when I say that, I mean that what your book talks about is the theft of this object. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq, this object, which was in the museum in Baghdad, among probably thousands of others, were stolen when the museum was looted. And the head was recovered sometime later with some damage to it, as were some other very famous objects. But even when they reopened the museum in 2009, it reopened without its entire collection. So that's its sort of modern history. It shows you it has value. And it clearly had value to the ancient Sumerians. Now, when I put up a picture like this, you don't have much to work from in this class. Teaching art history is hard. You don't physically see the object, and here you're looking at a picture. So please do look at the caption. The caption gives you some information. So if you were going to look at this, we don't know who she is. We're calling her the head of a woman. We usually call it the Warka head. We know an approximate date, but it's very, very approximate. The useful piece of information here, two things. Its size and its material. First of all, its size, because what you're going to find out in this class, as in every art history class, through the magic of PowerPoint, I'm going to show you an image that's 2 inches, and it's going to look the same size as an image that's 200 feet, because I'm showing you them all in the same size. So you're probably looking at this picture about life size right now. It's an 8-inch high head, and the other important piece is that it's marble. Okay, so I've already said that the Sumerians did not have access to good local stone, and yet this is made of marble, which is a very high quality stone, which already tells you something, which is that this is a very important object and a very important subject. Whoever this woman is, she's incredibly important. To say that it's made out of marble means that that stone had to be imported at some considerable distance and some considerable expense. If you've ever picked up a 8-inch chunk of marble, it's probably 20 or 30 pounds. I mean, this is a heavy object. And that had to be shipped from somewhere and dragged by waterway and by cart to reach its destination. It also tells you that the Sumerians either had some skill in carving marble, which they probably shouldn't have too much of it because they don't have too much marble, or they may have used a foreign artist. It's entirely possible that when they ordered this from its foreign destination, that they had stonecutters working on it as well. But in any case, we're left with that object. So, you, as you look at this object, have to start thinking about what this object tells us. What do we read from this object? It's a very well-carved face, meaning this person clearly, it's very sensitively done. In other words, you could see the real structure of the face. The ears look like real ears. They're carefully studied. You could see, subtle details like the softness under the chin, where it's a little bit fleshy. You can make out the cheekbones. I mean, this is somebody who is studying human faces around them and studying from life. But there are some peculiar things about it. You may notice the missing eyes, the hollowed out eyes. The broken nose is just a factor of its condition. When statues fall over, they tend to land on their noses. Anything that sticks out is vulnerable. You'll notice the etched-in eyebrows, the Sumerian unibrow, I like to call it. I mean, there is a favor of this very geometric frame to the eyes, calling attention to those eyes. There's a wedge in the top of the head, and very peculiar-looking, flattened, indented hair. And you also could see, if you look on the side view, both on the picture on the left and on the picture on the right, you can make out holes underneath the ears. So that's some more evidence that we can look at here and try to figure out what happened. And what you'll figure out is that those eyes are missing. I mean, the statue clearly had eyes. It had other stuff that's gone. And if you say to yourself, why would it be missing? There's really only two guesses. That whatever material it was made out of, the eyebrows, the eyes, the hair, was either more perishable than stone, so it didn't survive while the stone head did, or was more valuable than stone, which is, more likely the presumption. Whatever this was made out of was more valuable than stone. So the Sumerians are making here a composite object. It's a stone face. Probably it would have been painted in its own time to look more lifelike. But the eyes were probably inset with gems, something precious. The eyebrows perhaps with lapis lazuli, which is a very expensive bright blue stone, like a cobalt blue stone that was imported from Afghanistan, which again shows evidence that the Sumerians were trading widely. And the hair probably had gold. It's probably a pounded gold wig that fit on top of her head with a headdress. The holes on the side of the head suggest earrings. So this was a much more elaborate object than what we're left with. Here you can see the photograph that your book uses, which, gives you another good piece of information, right? Even if it's not a very good picture of the object. It shows you that object is life-size. I mean, look at her head compared to the head of and those are not small heads those men have. Her head, that's a life-size figure, right, that head. So there's another good question. If you just have a head that size, what is it? It could be a head that goes on a shelf. But there's another very good possibility. And I would imagine if you had the object in front of you, you'd be looking for clues, like whether or not that head belonged to a body. I mean, a life-size head could very well be a fragment of a life-size statue, meaning that 8-inch head could be part of a 5-foot statue. There is, in fact, a place on the neck where it indicates that this was once attached to a body. Okay? So what happened to the body? And again, you have choices. The body could be also made out of marble but might be missing. In other words, the statue broke and somebody cut a clean line on it and now it's just a head. Which would have meant that the Sumerians had to drag an awful lot more marble from wherever they were bringing it. More likely, they used cheap, perishable material for the body. You could use clay, you could use wood, and the reason for this would be it would allow you to make a life-size figure at less expense, mostly because the body would have been draped with clothing. So rich fabrics could be put over the body. And now you start to get the picture. She was colored. She had color on her face. She had colored eyes made out of stones. She had colored eyebrows, beaten gold sheets of hair, dressed fully clothed. So now the question of who she is gets raised. Okay, that may not be the best reconstruction ever. It looks a little bit sad. The first time I taught at Bergen Community College, I was evaluated by the dean. Every semester your faculty members get visited by somebody, by the dean and by another professor who come to watch your class. And I went in for my evaluation afterwards, and it was a fine evaluation, and then the very last line said, for suggestions, professors should not call art stupid or bad. And there I am thinking to myself, I love this stuff, thinking to myself, when did I get up in front of the room and put up a picture like this head and say, that head is stupid? Like, that didn't sound like me. And then I realized after a long conversation that they were referring to me putting up a reconstruction like this, where I was like, this is a bad reconstruction. What do I mean by that? It's not artistically done. I don't know that it looked as cheap, as cheesy perhaps as this drawing does, but that's okay. The point of it is that is just simply a suggestion. I put it up just so you can get a sense of it, a little bit of an indication of how this object would have been used. Now I'm taking it a step further and saying that she wouldn't be on a post like that. She would be on a full body, all decked out. So who is the Warka head? Your book, dances around. It's the head of a woman. If she's a woman, who is she? I mean, certainly if she's a woman, she has to be a queen. She has to be royalty. I would suggest instead, based on the absolute preciousness of materials and the care and expense which someone had to go through to do this, she's probably a goddess. The city worshipped the goddess, I believe it's Inanna, who was the goddess of love and war. And this was probably the kind of statue you would put inside the cella, inside that little worship room, inside the temple, on top of the ziggurat. So this would stand there and people could come and see physically the goddess and leave offerings to her. The question is, when people came, what did they do? And they probably came and brought offerings of their own. So let's look at this object. Here's another object. This is another temple object. By the way, in terms of commonality, this is another object that was stolen from the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in 2003 and then later recovered, albeit in 14 pieces. So it was broken, but that's okay. It had been broken before. And in fact, when you look at this vase, you could see that there's some significant areas of loss. In other words, it's been broken, some pieces are missing, and they've put it back together. So if you look at that bottom of the vase, you'll see some blank areas. Some of that is lost, meaning that's just a patch, a modern reconstruction. So what is this? Your book is just calling it a carved vessel from Uruk or from Warka. It's from the same place as that head. But it's actually what's what we call a votive vessel, meaning this is a vase that seems to have been made for the purposes of putting offerings in it and bringing it to the temple and leaving the vase and the objects in it as a gift to the goddess. This is what people did. A votive, the idea of a votive offering, is simply that you give an offering either in thanks for something the god has done for you, or you give an offering in order to get favor for what you want going forward in the future. Okay? I mean, there certainly are modern days equivalents of this. I mean, I've traveled all over Europe, and when I was in Italy, you could go to the church of the Santo, which is the church of St. Anthony of Padua, in Padua, and you walk around the back of the saint's tomb, and there's things tied to it. Gifts, ropes with flowers with ropes tied around them, objects that show body parts, which you would leave if you had a knee ailment. You'd leave a picture or a little sculpture of a knee on it. There was a picture of a car crash, a bad car crash, and somebody left it there with a note thanking St. Anthony for what he'd done in saving them. Right. So this is a long-standing tradition that the Sumerians participated in. So okay, the question is, when you have to decorate a vase, what do you do first? Vases are hard to decorate, and that's because they need to be visible from all sides, legible from all sides. This is a significant vase. This is 3 feet high, so again, read your captions. It's made out of alabaster, which is a kind of mineral that is not durable. It's not sufficient for building. They clearly had access to alabaster, but it's water soluble to some degree, so it's a fragile stone. Okay, so what do you do when you decorate a vase? Here, what the artist has chosen to do to create scenes is to divide the vase into registers or friezes. A frieze or register is just a long horizontal band, and they're registers because you could put them one on top of the other. So here, this is a vase that you read from the bottom up. At the very, very base, you see the wavy line, which shows you maybe a suggestion of water, and again, these are people who live on the rivers. Above it is a band that's actually divided into 2 parts. The lower part has plants, identifiable plants, date palm and some other things. And above it, animals walking. And they alternate male and female, male and female. Okay, so right off the bat, that tells you what this vase is about. It's about the need for fertility. For life, how do you get life? Well, how do the Sumerians have life? They need the waters to be favorable to them. They need their crops to be successful. They need their animals to reproduce. So the bottom tells you exactly what it is that the Sumerians want. And we're going to read the vase from the bottom, and we're going to go up. And now listen, the term hierarchy is on your panel here in red. There's different kinds of hierarchy. Just says what's important, what is more important, less important. This vase uses hierarchy in 2 ways. There's hierarchy of placement, meaning that what's most important on the vase we expect to see at the top of the vase. So the bottom has this animal natural world, and the goddess, who ultimately is the goal of what we see here, is going to be at the top. There's also a hierarchy of scale. What is important is larger, and that's a very typical convention in early art. It's not natural. I mean, someone can be more important than you. It doesn't make them bigger. Napoleon was important, right? But in this case, the idea is that as a visual clue, even though it's against what you see in nature, things that are important are larger. So let's have a look. I'll show you an image that gives you the top 2 registers in a little bit more detail. I know this picture's a little bit blurry, but it's useful. It's the top two registers unfolded so we can see what's going on. So now you see the second register. So the bottom is plants and animals and water. The second register, you actually read in the opposite direction. So the figures, instead of moving like the animals from left to right, here are moving from right to left. And we see a procession of not totally identical, but nearly identical nude human figures who are walking and carrying vases and jars, kind of like the vase you're looking at, you see. So these people are worshippers. They're nude. They present themselves with humility, nude before the gods. And they're each bringing an offering. It's very simplistically shown, okay? And I mean that not that it's not well done. But there's no background. There's no sense of place. There's no overlapping. The figures are lined up, and they take up the whole height of their friezes. So the focus really is on the human figure. Finally, at the top, and now you can read from the left to right again, we switch. We see at the very left-hand side of your picture and some sort of an attendant. He's someone important because he's clothed, but he's not the king. He's the attendant, we think, to the king. You can see he's holding like a piece of fabric, which might be part of the king's outfit. And the king is missing. In front of him is another nude attendant approaching, who we see in the very center of the top, which is the goddess herself. How do we know it's the goddess? She's the tallest in terms of scale. She takes up the full height of the highest band. She's clothed. Now, that attendant over there was clothed, but he's small. She's fully clothed, suggesting that she's someone of importance, and she is the one who's receiving these gifts. So what's going on? We think what the Sumerians are showing here is what's called the New Year's Festival, which they think they celebrated in early spring. And the idea was that in order to ensure healthy crops and a good growing season, you had to make offerings to Inanna, and you'd be granted those things. So here they are bringing offerings of what they want, which is a good harvest. And I think the part of their ceremony involved like a mock marriage between the priest king, the ruler of the city, and the goddess. So we're missing the priest king, but that's probably what's going on. And then you see behind Inanna a collection of objects. Some are identifiable, some aren't, that are the gifts she's been given. So there's like animals, which are sacrifices, jars with goods in them. Those two poles behind her may actually be a reference to her name. There's two little people, which may be statues. So that's what we're looking at. Now, I gave you one other word on your sheet, which is composite pose, right? That was on the slide before this in red. Composite pose. It's a very important term, and it's going to come back a lot. Let's go to the next slide. I'll show you up close. Okay, so what is composite pose? Now, carving a vase like this requires a couple choices. Now, this is carved in what we would call low relief. Now, okay, this is a sculptural object, but it's not a sculpture in the round. I'm a sculpture in the round. If I stand up and I was a sculpture, I'd be a sculpture in the round. You could walk around me. I'm carved on the front. I'm carved on the back. This is a relief sculpture. Relief sculpture means that the figures are attached to a ground. You can't walk around the figure of Inanna. You could see her from the front, but she's stuck to the ground. Now, when you carve in relief, you can carve in high relief. You could carve in low relief, or a combination of the two. High relief means, like, if you backed up against a wall, you'd be a high relief. In other words, you protrude really far from the surface, but you're not detached like an in-the-round sculpture. Low relief sculptures are flat, and they barely protrude. It's a little bit safer. They don't break as easily, but it's harder to see because high relief forms cast real shadows, whereas low relief forms are really kind of flat. This is a low relief vase. And now the artist has to figure out in low relief how to show the human figure. Now, if I stand in front of you and you try to carve me onto a vase, it's very hard to do because some parts of me stick out and are very three-dimensional, and you have to show it on a flat surface. And what artists resort to is a technique called composite view. Composite view says that you show, instead of the whole body from one point of view, you show each individual body part from the view that is most characteristic. By that I mean, if I ask you right now to draw a foot on your paper, you're probably going to draw a foot in profile. You're not going to draw the foot pointing at you with the toes coming at you. We easily recognize feet from the side. If I ask you to draw a torso, from the waist to the shoulders, you're going to draw it from the front. You're not going to draw it from the side. We recognize torsos from the front. Profile faces are easier to draw than frontal faces. Frontal eyes, if I say draw an eye, you're going to draw it facing forward. You're not going to draw it facing the side. So that's what the Sumerian artist essentially does. If you look at these bodies, all the legs are in very strict profile, straight from the side. The torsos are mostly frontal, like Inanna's torso. Even though she has profile feet, her torso faces straight out at you, right? That's composite pose. The servants, the nude people who walk, are in like 3/4 view. In other words, their profiles of their torsos are not strictly in profile. They're twisted a little bit so that we see more of the front than we would otherwise see. But the faces are in profile of all of the figures. But their eyes face forward, right? So this is what composite view does. It mixes together a group of different viewpoints so that we see things in a way that we understand them rather than in a way that's necessarily optically correct. Here you could just see a detail of the figures up close, right? So there's the Inanna. There's very little, even though the figures are nude, there's very little interest in the body per se. The artist is not trying to show you anatomical realism or focus on muscles. They're trying to impart meaning, which this does very successfully. I have to tell you, when I go to museums or I teach these classes, I go shopping. Again, mentally shopping in my head. And this is the first thing this semester I'd like to own. Like, I would like these guys. I would put them on my mantle. They're wonderful. These are called votive figures. Look, the fact that these survive is also luck, I suppose, but there were probably thousands upon thousands of these in Sumerian times. A group of these statues, these were found, now in 1920s or 30s. They were buried in a temple in like a square pit that was dug in the ground. And we don't know why they were buried. It's possible that the people who had bought them and paid for them were long dead and they were no longer needed. It's also possible that the Sumerian city of Ashuna was under siege, and so they were buried to protect them. We don't really know. But it's good luck for us that they were buried, because when they were discovered, even though they were broken, they were found in place and they could be reassembled. And we've pieced together a lot more about our understanding of ancient Sumeria from these guys. So what are they? We're calling them votive figures, which means the same thing that votive meant before. A votive offering is a gift given to the gods for thanks or for favors. And so that's what these figures seem to be. So what does that mean? The figures themselves, although there's some debate, the figures have been largely identified as worshippers. Meaning, let's say you were a pretty well-off Sumerian, what would you do? You would go to the sculptor's store. I have the feeling these were prefabricated, meaning you wouldn't order one. You'd probably go pick one out that kind of looked good enough, like you. And you would pick out one of these statues. You would buy a bigger statue if you had more money to spend. If you didn't have much money to spend, but you were still well off enough to buy a statue, you'd buy a little one. And then you'd go up to the ziggurat, you'd climb it, you'd go to the temple, and you would leave it there as an offering to the deity. Now, this is a cool concept, because yes, it's an offering to the god or goddess, but it also means that, you have a stand-in for prayer. You can't pray 24/7. You have things to do. So these statues would stand there purposefully praying to the deities in your absence. So you notice, for example, several things. The hands are clasped in front of them. They're actually holding small little cups, which may show that they're participating in a New Year's festival, making an offering to the gods. They also have enormous eyes that are meant to show their alert, attentive gaze. Right? It's that visual connection between them and the gods that allows them to pray. So the Sumerians have not only that very strong, again, that strong unibrow, right, to frame the eyes, but they give the figures large, and actually the more important figures seem to have the largest eyes. I just said the most important figure. How do we know who's important here? Again, it comes down to hierarchy of scale. Important people have figures that are large, and also the largest eyes as well. Now, I'll show you a detail of two of them in color. The figures are, you could see, made of composite material. Some of them are actually limestone, which is not as good quality as marble, but suggests imported stone. The others are alabaster. Gypsum is a kind of alabaster, which again is water-soluble, not very durable materials. But the artist here is trying to make them last as long as they can. The forms are very simplistic. they're reduced to pure geometry. So what I mean by that is that instead of trying to show a body the way a body appears, the legs are enormous cylinders, which, by the way, would keep the statue intact, hopefully, if this base is wide enough. The body is just a truncated cone for the men. For the woman, it's another cylindrical form, very round heads, round eyes. So the body is simplified to things that are just easily understandable. Now I said that for the most part we believe these to be worshippers. There are some debates. Some scholars have suggested that these two figures, which are the largest of the group, he comes in at about 30 inches. So, that's 2.5 feet high. He's substantial. That those two figures may be gods and goddesses. For him, the suggestion was not only because of his size, but because there's some inscription on the base. But my guess is that when you purchased one of these statues, and again, I think they were made already. You just said, I need a man. All the men are basically, they look the same. They all have what I call the French fry beard. It's like a crinkle cut beard. That's not a technical term. That's just what I call it. They all have similar features, which suggests that's not a portrait. No one looks like that. But it's a type. So my guess is instead that they probably all were inscribed on the base, but they may have been painted. So maybe we've just lost the inscriptions. You'd want an inscription on it because, when other people come to the temple, these are little objects of propaganda. You would want somebody to know that you're devout and praying all day long. So your name on it becomes an important issue. So some people say that these are goddesses. I'm going to suggest that they're simply the most well-off of the community. You can actually see that the woman, there are two women in that group I showed you, at least. They're identifiable. They've got the off-the-shoulder garment, and she's got one breast out. You see her two breasts. She actually also has a little child. If you look down to her left side, you can just see a pair of feet cut off, like in the mid-calf. And my guess, again, that's a separate piece that was fit in, and yes, the child's been broken. But what probably happened, again, you would go and order and say, I'm a woman, but I want my child on it, and they would insert a child drill a hole and insert a child into the base. They are, by the way, the eyes, which I'll show you, are inset with other materials. So those are probably made out of, you could use shell. They inset the eyes using bitumen, which is tar, again, to call attention to that medium. And here you could also see that they were painted. So that tells us a little bit about what Sumerian religious art looked like. And as I said, what is important to a culture tends to be reflected by what survives. They had so much of it that some of it survives. For Sumerians, we have one other big category of art. There's the religious votive art on one side, which tells us what was important while they lived. But the other place we have a lot of Sumerian art are in tombs. So that also tells us that the Sumerians were very concerned about their life after they die. And there have been a number of Sumerian tombs that have been uncovered and excavated. Not for everyday people. The tombs were elaborate, what we would call royal tombs. A man named Leonardo Woolley and his wife excavated over the course of about 12 years 16 different royal tombs in the 1920s and 1930s, including the royal tomb from which this object comes. And so they found a lot of other really interesting objects to look at. Now this object, okay, it's a little bit problematic. Let me tell you the story. First of all, you'll notice it's in Philadelphia. When the question might be, how did this object get to Philadelphia? We were just looking at objects that are in Baghdad. The deal was, back in the day, that if professional archaeologists came to the region, and very often archaeologists came to the ancient Near East from Germany or England or the United States, they would come, fund an excavation, excavate the land, and the deal was they had a deal with the government where they would give the local government 50% of the objects they excavated, while the other 50% was divided up among the sponsoring institutions of the excavation. So this ends up in Philadelphia. What is it? It's a lyre that was part of a funerary site. Okay, now what you're looking at here is not all ancient. A lyre, by the way, is a stringed musical instrument. What you're looking at here, the wood is modern. So the only thing that survived from Sumerian times are that bull's head and then the 4-panel of narrative decoration right underneath it. See, what the Woolies did, it was actually quite cool. They would excavate, they would dig in the dirt, they and their team, and they didn't have all the same sophisticated techniques we have now. Now you can use sonar and the like. But what they would do is they would listen, they would feel for hollows in the dirt. And let's say you bury something wood, The wood is going to perish because it's been, 5,000 years or 4,500 years. The wood perishes, but the dirt around it stays in place, so you'd have a hollow in the ground. So what they did is, as they came upon a hollow in the ground, they would pour in plaster, and it would settle in, and they would be able to see the shape of what it was that was once there. This is how they preserve what people looked like when they died in the explosions at Pompeii from Mount Vesuvius. In this case, it's actually a good story. They poured plaster into a hole, and there were several musical instruments that would be in these burials. And what happened was, in this particular case, 2 instruments were next to each other. And so, for the longest time, they had recreated this as a weird hybrid instrument before they determined that, in fact, it was a simple lyre, which exists in many cultures. It's a bull-headed lyre. Here it's called the Great Lyre with the Bull's Head. I've always called it the bull-headed lyre. Those names are not real titles, they're just descriptive titles. In that, the bull probably tells you what sound the instrument made, so that would suggest it's a low-pitched instrument. The bull, by the way, shows you that whoever died here had some serious bucks. But they all did. They were royal tombs. Ooh, they were good. You got buried with your household goods, with your gems, with your jewels, and with your servants. So your servants and retainers, people would come. They had musicians who would come and play at your funeral, and then before the burial, they would kill themselves on your grave, and they would be buried with you, holding their instruments. And that's what happened here. Some person died holding this lyre, who seems to have been one of the king's retainers. That's pretty good stuff. In any case, it shows you they also had serious wealth because of the instrument itself. The head, which I think is probably, it could be a wood head underneath there. I think it's wood. Don't ask how that survives. But the bull's head is covered in gold leaf, which is just gold beaten into very, very thin sheets. But very precious, and inset with bitumen, which is tar and shell to create the eyes and the hair. And then you see that beard of the bull, that bright blue, that's lapis lazuli, imported from Afghanistan, more expensive than gold, highly, highly prized. Here's a picture, by the way, I love these old photographs, of the Woolies, Catherine and Leonard Woolley. And there they are. You could see them excavating in the foreground. You see locals excavating. And so they always went to site whenever there was something really good to find. This is the panel from the sound box, so underneath the bull's head. And I'm showing you this for, I guess, a really important reason, which you're going to find very entertaining. It's kind of to tell you that the past is opaque, meaning we can look at something and we know it had a great deal of meaning to the people of its own time, but sometimes those meanings are impossible to discover from our perspective. Okay, so what we have are 4 separate panels stacked on top of each other. The top one showing a man wrestling 2 human-headed bulls. Oh, by the way, that type of composition, if you have a central element and then it's paired or mirrored images with the same object on either side, that type of composition is called a heraldic composition. Just the category. And that type will come back. Beneath it, 1 level down, we have some sort of an animal, a dog perhaps, carrying a table covered with meat and animal heads, holding a knife in his belt, followed by a lion with a wine pitcher. Below, some other cow-like animal who's actually playing a bull-headed lyre. He's playing the instrument that this is on. It's kind of like the people on the vase carrying vases. Here's the animal on the lyre playing a lyre, with a dancing bear, and some animal shaking a zither. Then down below, we see the human-headed scorpion man, and a jackal or a gazelle of some sort making an after-dinner speech and toast. What do we do about this? What does this mean? Okay, it tells you they're sophisticated. It's made with shell that's set into this bitumen, which is a kind of tar. So a pretty exquisite technique. But what this tells us, if nothing else, is that we don't know everything about the Sumerians. We don't know what this means. We know that the Sumerians banqueted while they lived. The banquets were an important part of ceremony and culture. What we might be looking at is the banquet in the underworld. The only figures we recognize here is the human-headed scorpion man. There's a scorpion man told in that Epic of Gilgamesh, that Sumerian poem, which makes him the guardian of the land of the dead. So that perhaps gives us a clue. For that reason, maybe the human figure at the top is the deceased. but we don't know. We don't know what the rest of it means. There's been suggestions that it's sort of like in Aesop's fables. They may represent stories that we no longer have preserved, but the Sumerians would know. They would look at that and this would have meaning to them. It could just be some sort of afterlife, underworld. They could be human figures or priests who are dressed up as animals for ceremonies. They all have human hands. We don't know the meaning of it. So I put that up along with the word iconography. Iconography is the act of writing with symbols. If I show you a red octagon, you know that means stop. You know it means stop because of iconography and from our culture. If you showed a red octagon to an ancient Sumerian, they don't know what that means. They might guess, they interpret. We're left kind of in the same situation, trying to decode a fairly complex and sophisticated visual language of a culture for which we don't have very much. What we have a lot of for the ancient Sumerians are cylinder seals. This is another object that it's not funerary in its purpose, but we find them in tombs. So what you're looking at here is the cylinder seal is actually the object all the way on the left. It's made of a precious material. This one's actually made of lapis lazuli. And it's got a design etched into the surface. And on the right you see that design turned into a relief. So what someone would do, this was a way of marking possessions, correspondence. You know, what you would do is you would put a piece of clay to seal something, and then you could roll this seal through it, right? And it would put an impression on that piece of clay that would identify you as the owner of the object. Okay, so it was a way to mark your stuff. You would have them made. A hole could be drilled through the actual seal, and it could be worn like a piece of jewelry or used as a toggle, as a pin. And people were often buried with them after they died. There were status symbols, and again, they were made out of precious stuff, and it says that you own stuff. But also, buried with you when you died because it had no other function to anybody else. It was really a marker of your ownership. So here you could see the impression. And listen, you can already start to recognize what is Sumerian here. The field is divided into 2 registers, which you've already seen. There's the use of hierarchy of scale, which we've already seen. We assume that Puabi, who is the queen from whose tomb this comes, is one of those seated figures, who is the same height as the standing figures who attend to her. So she's actually much larger in scale. You could see people bringing wine, and actually those same kind of serving trays we just saw in the lyre sound box, playing musical instruments. It gives us some idea of what Sumerian life, furniture, feasts actually looked like. But at the same time, it shows the artist thinking about certain issues. If you make a cylinder seal as a design issue, you have to have a pattern and an image that works well if you only roll it 2 inches or if you roll it 3 feet. So it has to be a design that works very well if you only see a fragment, and a design that looks very well if you see it repeated multiple times. For this reason, battle scenes are used. Here you could see, actually the scene up top looks like an animal hunt. Down below you could see another image of the seal and a banqueting scene. This one actually has the name of the person on it, which you'd imagine be fairly common. You could see on the lower impression, it's another banqueting scene like the seal I showed you, with the same sorts of furniture and attendants. But you can also see the inscriptions, right? Those little triangular and square marks, which is cuneiform writing, which would have identified who the owner was. And finally, a few others. I hear there are other good subjects on cylinder seals, like they have ritual sex images, but I've never seen them. You should look, by the way. There's about a ton of these, dozens of these. At the Met, for example, you can see cylinder seals and their impressions. Now, just to show you 2 more objects before we leave Sumeria. The story about the Sumerians is eventually they do fall. The Sumerians fell to the Akkadians, but then the Neo-Sumerian state arose. We're going to treat it all as one body. All it means is that the king of Ur reorganized the Sumerians and sort of created a more unified Sumerian state after pushing back the invaders. I'm showing you this object because it's a ziggurat that's a little bit more intact. So we looked at that early ziggurat, right, the Anu ziggurat. I want to show you now, this is the Nana ziggurat. Nana is the moon goddess, I believe. And that's the goddess that was the patron goddess of the city of Ur. So we're in a different city than we were before. But I wanted to show you a ziggurat you could actually see, because it's been reconstructed fairly well. So here's an aerial view of a ziggurat with walls about 50 feet high. It's a little bit larger, but the same rules apply. The corners of the ziggurat are still aligned with the points on the compass. So they always arrange the ziggurats in a similar way. And this ziggurat, later ones tend to be square, but some of them are rectangular. This is another rectangular ziggurat, about 205 by 141 feet at the base. Here you could see a frontal view. Oh, and there's a person on the top left for a little bit of scale. So this is the ziggurat. We don't have the temple on top anymore, so we can't talk too much about the approach. However, this has not one but 3 sets of staircases. You could see the one straight in front of you, and then there's 2 more that come, one from the left and one from the right, suggesting again that bent axis approach is relevant here. This ziggurat, you could see, is much more intact on the side walls. It's got walls that actually, see how they jut out and then recess and then jut out? That's to strengthen the structure, to give it a little bit more visual interest. And in fact, they would embed things like woven mats into the clay to make it adhere and last a little bit longer. So there were 3 sets of staircases that all met at the top, 100 steps apiece. Then they met at the top, and then there was another staircase that led up to another second level of the ziggurat, about 17 feet above the first level. So it's a 2-story ziggurat at least, and then we presume that there was either a 3rd story or there may have been a temple on top. We don't know. But just so you could see what it looks like intact, there are rectangular holes that I have been asked about on the exterior of the structure that you might see here. Those were actually, they were called weeping holes. And that was a way to, again, to facilitate drainage issues for rare cases of precipitation, I guess. I mean, so water could actually make its way off of the platform through those without hurting the structure. So, okay, I come back to the ziggurat just to make that simple point. Now here's our last Sumerian object, but it's a good one. And this is part of the later Sumerian, Neo-Sumerian times. The story of Judea is a little bit interesting. He was the ensi, or the ruler, of the city of Lagash. Lagash was a city that didn't fall to the Akkadians. So when the Akkadians conquer the Sumerians, Lagash survives. They apparently bribed off whoever they had to keep the city independent. And so they remained independent, but then become part of this Neo-Sumerian state. Here's the ruler, his name is Judea. And this is a votive statue of him. Now we know who he is. You could see, unlike those little statues, the little votive figures, and this is part of the same tradition. The little votive figures, it was rare that the name was on the big one. It made us question whether or not he's a deity. In this case, Judea is covered in inscriptions, and you could see he's got inscriptions all the way around his garment. They go around the back. And in fact, there are 20 statues of Judea. He was a ruler, and what he did is he rebuilt a lot of temples in his region, and he also built and rebuilt temples. So he built new ones. He said, he wrote on one of these, on one of his statues, it actually says that he had visions where the gods asked him to rebuild the temples, and in return he would bring them prosperity, good crops, water, and wool, which are all the things that the Sumerians depended upon. So what he did was every time he rebuilt a temple, he put one of these statues in it. And because of the inscriptions, we know it's always him. He's also quite recognizable. It's interesting, because this is part of the same votive tradition. He's in the same pose. Fully frontal, symmetrical. Large, wide eyes. Unibrow sort of framing the eyes. Hands clasped in front of his chest. Elbows held tight to the body. Holding an object, an offering. In this case, it's not just a little votive cup, but it's actually a vase from which water emerges, and you can actually see little fish swimming on the sides of those water streams. It tells you what Judea wants in this particular case. He needs a good water time. He needs the water to be plentiful. He doesn't want flood. He wants the bounty that water brings. He's also, by the way, he's a ruler, so this is propaganda. Right? I mean, people would come, they knew this is fine, it's for the gods. He makes it so that the gods, see that he's done a good thing and that he's pious. But it's also propaganda. The people saw it too. He could show himself with a crown. He could show himself rich. He shows himself humble. He's barefoot. He wears a very simple woolen hat on his head because wool was one of the crops that were important to his people. So he identifies himself as one of them. At the same time, he also says he's more important. I mean, it's sort of interesting. So on the one hand, it's very much like those earlier statues. On the other hand, there's more stuff going on here. As always, read the inscription. Oh, okay, the inscription may not mean too much to you. He's 29 inches high, which is about the same height as the big votive statue. So he's not enormous, still substantially big at about 2.5 feet. But covered with inscriptions. And you'll notice the material listed here for this statue is called diorite. Diorite is a very hard, expensive, durable stone. It did not come from Sumeria. It had to be imported, maybe from Egypt. I mean, it had to come some distance to get a stone like this. You could tell it's a really hard stone. You see the polish on the statue? That tends to come with stones that are very fine-grained and hard and durable. And Judea, not on this statue, but on one of his other statues, they all bear long inscriptions, actually says how important the material is. He writes on the statue, "This statue has not been made from silver, nor from lapis lazuli, nor from copper, nor from lead, nor yet from bronze. It is made of diorite." So he's actually calling attention to the fact that he had the wealth, the means, the will to procure this very expensive stone and had it set up here. It shows his status, even if he's shown otherwise humble. The other thing that he does, and you could see this here, is that, look, if you have a votive statue that's meant to pray for you for eternity, eternity becomes important. You want the statue to last a long time. So the question is, how can you ensure that? One of the ways you could do, besides using a very hard material, like diorite, that would be one way to make sure this thing lasts. But you also can make choices as an artist, and I think you could see them here. For example, unlike those earlier votive statues, where the legs were independent cylinders, here the legs are not what I would say cut through. You could see the feet, but the garment extends all the way to the ground to make that a very wide, strong base where nothing's going to be easily broken. The arms are held tight against the body so that there are no gaps. The neck is made wide, right? So this is all about a person who is trying to make an object that would survive longer than he does, that his legacy survives, and that his goodwill to the gods survives. The last thing I'm showing you, by the way, is just another statue of Judea. As I said, he made like 20 of these statues that are all identifiable as him. This is another example of one of these statues. Oh, look, the efforts to make the head impervious to breakage usually didn't work. I think you can even see on the Louvre statue on the right that statue has been decapitated and recapitated, right? The head's been knocked off and reassembled. But you could see on the left, I mean, he doesn't have a head, but the rest of him, same rules. Feet close together, close to the body. The chair has legs, but they're not cut through. The arms are against the body, so there's no points to break. And it's hard, shiny stone. And with the exception of a little bit of a break on the left knee, it's very much intact. I just showed you that one because it's another really good example of a Judea statue because he's got, look, so the same characteristics, the symmetry. You'll notice in Judea, it's more of a portrait. I mean, you would never recognize one of those other little votive statues from a shuna. They don't look like real people. This is probably idealized, meaning he looks better than he does. But there's some real attention to his face, to his body. You could see the sense of musculature in the arms, very specific toes. Like somebody is studying the body for this. It's not the simplified cylindrical stuff that we saw with the votive statues. But what's great about the statue on the left is you could see that he's got a tablet. He's got a stone tablet or a clay tablet probably on his lap. What that is, it's actually a drawing of a temple. So here Judea shows himself praying and actually giving to the gods a plan for another building he's going to build for them. In any case, I'm going to stop here. And at the next class, we're going to pick up and talk about other Mesopotamian cultures. Please read your book and keep up that way. It's going to be the best way for you to help make sense of what I've talked about today. And I hope you don't feel overwhelmed. The good news about our online class is that you can listen to this again if you want to. Okay? So, you'll hear from me next time. Bye, class.